Hello there, everyone, and welcome to an essay video series from yours truly, the Sea Monster. And this series shall be devoted to Godzilla vs. Kong. Godzilla vs. Kong is the fourth entry in the MonsterVerse, which was released in 2021 and was directed by Adam Wingard, the filmmaker who brought us films such as You're Next and Blair Witch, as in the 2016 film in the Blair Witch franchise. This film was a highly anticipated release and was reasonably successful both critically and financially, with the latter factor being rather surprising considering the mid-pandemic atmosphere. At the time of its release, it was the most successful film to be released during the pandemic. It was especially anticipated by many fans, myself included, as well as even casual people or general audiences, as it was a new iteration of the classic matchup between Godzilla and King Kong, only preceded by King Kong vs. Godzilla, released by Toho back in 1962. This was a long-awaited cinematic rematch that was 59 years in the making. When I first saw the film around the time that it first came out, I absolutely loved it. I saw it twice in theaters, with the first time being where I had to go all the way from home, an hour away in fact, just to see it in theaters so that I could experience it for the first time on the big screen, just as I did with the past entries of the MonsterVerse, because my local theater wasn't even open at the time. And I watched it twice on HBO Max, so that would equal to about 4 times before its release on Blu-ray, with the number of times being the same as I did for Godzilla King of the Monsters 2019. In fact, I still love Godzilla vs. Kong, and consider it to be a well-done cinematic outing featuring an epic showdown between two of the most iconic movie monsters of all time. However, I do consider it to not quite be the best film in the MonsterVerse, as well as a film that isn't without its faults. And so here we are with this essay video series where I will be going into why that's the case. While I may be throwing my hat into the ring of discussion later than most of my fellow content creators in the kaiju fan community, I figured that it's worth looking back on this film now that it's been out for a while and with the hype surrounding it having passed. For this series, I shall be assessing the overall quality in Godzilla vs. Kong, primarily in the realm of objectivity, with my own subjective thoughts on the film only playing into a small portion of the assessment. In order to make a proper assessment in the film's overall quality, we will be covering the film's contents and its cinematic predecessors as references, and those only. Third-party materials such as novelizations and tie-in comics will not play a part in assessing the film's quality. Only references that are present in the film itself shall be permitted, as well as references that are present in its predecessors. Keep in mind that this is coming from a place of love, from someone who, from Godzilla 2014 all the way to Godzilla vs. Kong, has considered the MonsterVerse to be a satisfying cinematic venture. I just have some points to make that hopefully could be taken into heart by anybody who is seeking to continue the series going forward. So, now that we've got all that covered, let's begin and get ready to rumble. Get it? Because it's about two monsters getting into a rumble with each other, you know. Anyways, on to the main event. So to start things off, let's relay what this movie is about. The plot in Godzilla vs. Kong is set about 5 years after the events of Godzilla King of the Monsters, as mankind finds itself in an unexpected predicament where Godzilla has seemingly turned on it. This resorts a team on Skull Island to make a daring move and take Kong off the island and take him to the Hollow Earth in order to find a means to combat against Godzilla. Meanwhile, a secret conspiracy in the human side of things starts to become uncovered that is connected to what is provoking Godzilla. These storylines all lead to a climactic clash of the titans between Godzilla and Kong. Okay, so first of all, let's discuss how the film handles its characters. The film's characters, or at least the more significant ones, are split up into three groups. We have the group of Nathan Lind, Dr. Eileen Andrews, and her adoptive Iwi daughter Gia, who are part of the expedition to take Kong to the Hollow Earth. We have the group of Madison Russell, Bertie Hayes, and Josh Valentine, who go off to investigate the cause of Godzilla's sudden aggressive behavior, which all ties into Apex Cybernetics. And finally, we have the affiliates of Apex, aka our human antagonists. Walter Simmons, the CEO, Walter's daughter Maya, who joins the Hollow Earth expedition in order to retrieve a power source for Apex's secret weapon and provide such means for our protagonists to get to the Hollow Earth, and Ren Sarazawa, who works with Simmons in operating their weapon. We do have Mark Russell returning from Godzilla King of the Monsters, serving as a prominent member of Monarch, monitoring Godzilla's movements, but he's only featured as a more minor character in the story. Anyway, let's get into the more prominent characters of the story, starting with our protagonists, particularly the ones who take part in the Kong side of things. First, we have Nathan Lind, played by Alexander Skarsgård. Nathan Lind is a geologist who also studied on the Hollow Earth theory despite being thought of by the public as a crackpot. He once had a brother who tragically died during a venture into the Hollow Earth that was a result of the technology that they had at the time not being up to standards for means of traveling to such a place, due to the constant inversions and fluctuations of gravity that result from trying to get to such a place. However, when Walter Simmons approaches him to help with an expedition into the Hollow Earth itself, Lind goes on to accompany Eileen Andrews, Gia, and Kong on a quest that involves a reliance on the Titan to lead them all to a potential power source for a means to contain Godzilla and his attacks. He eventually goes on to resuscitate Kong by overloading a Hollow Earth aerial vehicle, or HEAV for abbreviation's sake. There isn't quite a lot to say about Nathan Lind, other than that he is determined to get Kong to the Hollow Earth in order to find such source, to where he is willing to let Kong out of his chains in order to defend himself against Godzilla. There is an inference to make that he is motivated to go to the Hollow Earth in memory of his brother, but it's a slight inference at best. Lind also shows a natural sense of wariness during moments such as when he meets Maya Simmons for the first time, while in the same vicinity as Kong, who, at that time, had just awakened to find himself chained up in the boat and showing to not be very happy about it, as well as when he tries to distract a Hellhawk from going after Eileen and Gia. This makes Lind grounded and somewhat relatable, considering how someone like a geologist wouldn't typically find themselves in a position to handle big creatures, let alone ones like a giant primate like Kong and a big freaky looking bat like bird, or to go on a big expedition into uncharted territory such as the Hollow Earth, where all sorts of dangers could come up, and that's not even counting Godzilla. However, while this is all well and good, it's still kind of odd for Nathan Lind, who again is established to be a geologist and not much more than that, to know how to pilot a HEAV as we see him in the film, to the point where he's pulling off maneuvers that even grade A pilots wouldn't even dare to attempt. Like how he flies through a building and doing barrel rolls in it while dodging Godzilla's atomic breath during the Hong Kong sequence. It's a very spectacular visual that's almost akin to a roller coaster ride, but it doesn't quite line up with what's been established about Nathan Lind when one thinks about it for even a moment. If it was made clear and established that he was once a pilot like his brother but retired and went on to go into geology full time after his brother was killed, then at least we could have some thread of logic there. As it is, though, this level of mastery in flight, especially with what is established about the HEAV being this new advanced form of aerial transportation, is, let's just say, a bit much. Aside from all that, though, Nathan Lind is a serviceable protagonist, even if he doesn't have a whole lot of depth to his character. Next up is Eileen Andrews, the adopted mother of Gia and the leading expert from Monarch on Kong. She is shown to be a caring and loving mother for Gia, and also shows a great deal of care about Kong and his well-being, such as when she initially goes against relocating Kong out of fear that Godzilla would come after him. Beyond that, she mostly tags along with Lind in order to monitor Kong and make sure that the expedition stays on the safest trajectory as possible. Obviously, that only lasts for so long. For the rest of the film, she's on the expedition and along for the ride, at least for the sake of Gia and her safety, whom we shall be getting to talking about right now. Gia is a young deaf girl from the now deceased Iwi tribe that was once native to Skull Island. She has a personal connection to Kong to where she even communicates to him through sign language, and even serves as a sort of guide for him at points. She was taken in by Eileen Andrews and, based on a line from Andrews, was looked after by Kong himself due to her being the last of the very tribe that saw him as their protector and god. Gia and her relationship with Kong is considered by many to be the heart and soul in the film, and understandably so, because it is the most developed relationship between a certain set of characters in the plethora of characters that are present. I must add that even though I can't really say that the acting is the most standout thing in this film, despite it being good overall, Kaylee Hoddle does a great job in portraying Gia. She does very well in conveying the emotions that her character feels about Kong, who is a fully CG character, and does a lot while acting only in front of green screen and through sign language. We've seen several examples of actors and actresses who rely on ASL for communication doing very well and pulling off great performances, such as Millicent Simmons in A Quiet Place and A Quiet Place Part 2, and I feel that Kaylee Hoddle as Gia in Godzilla vs. Kong should be added to that list. The next set of characters whom we'll look into is the group that investigates Apex Cybernetics, who also serve as the secondary group of protagonists. In this group, only one character, Bernie Hayes, is worth going into a decent amount of detail for. Madison Russell serves as a recurring character from previous MonsterVerse films, or film in her case, who tracks Bernie through his podcast and encourages Bernie to go deep into investigating Apex. Meanwhile, Josh Valentine is mainly a tag-along / comic relief character who does one thing of importance during the climax of the film, which is using Bernie's flask of whiskey to temporarily short-circuit Mechagodzilla. So all of that now leaves us with good old Bernie, the conspiracy theorist who runs a podcast and who is aware of Apex's suspicious activity and leads the quest to uncover the truth. There is a hint that his obsession is motivated by the passing of his wife / fiancé. Supposedly, the novelization for Godzilla vs. Kong suggests that she was killed by Apex in an attempt to cover up their activity, though the film itself doesn't show or state through dialogue anything to suggest that being the case. As I've said earlier, explanations and third-party materials will not count in assessing the film's overall quality. I will say, though, that it's kinda interesting that the Titan Truth podcast wasn't looked into seemingly by Apex itself, nor that the company at any point recognized Bernie's voice from the logs on the website if they did look into it. Perhaps Apex is one of those companies that doesn't look into what their employees do outside of the workplace. I mean, it's not exactly unheard of that there are companies out there who only do background checks on people they hire to look out for any sort of criminal record or some such things, but doesn't really look into much else, such as, let's say, social media. But it is kind of strange that they wouldn't do that with Bernie, considering that there is a website devoted to making logs about conspiracies regarding Titans and Apex itself. Maybe Bernie could have added a filter to his voice to make his identity more anonymous and less easy to uncover. And no, I don't mean anonymous with a capital A, but rather with a lowercase a. So, with that in mind, it's not like a voice filter would give Madison and Josh much trouble in finding Bernie via his prominent use of bleach for personal hygiene. Nonetheless, Bernie does serve well as a comic relief character with a purpose and some level of intrigue in his backstory. Apart from Kaylee Hoddle, Brian Tyree Henry is a standout in this film, as he does great at playing such an eccentric character and pulling off the mannerisms of a conspiracy geek. I personally consider him to be a very entertaining character with a lot of funny lines and interactions, but I also do recognize that he serves a solid enough purpose in the plot to where, without him, the rest of the movie, at least on his end, wouldn't happen. In fact, without him and his side of the story, certain things at the end of the film might have played out a whole lot differently. Anyways, moving right along. So finally, we have the human antagonists, the characters who run Apex Cybernetics. First, we have the CEO of Apex, Walter Simmons, who doesn't really have much going for him in terms of backstory. In fact, the film does sort of hint at him being motivated since 2014 to put mankind back at the top of the food chain once titans such as Godzilla were revealed to the world to be a real thing. However, he's killed off abruptly by Mechagodzilla before we get that much into detail. I will say Damien Bichir does a pretty good job at the role, even if his role doesn't really quite give him as much to really work with beyond just simply a villainous CEO corporate type of character that is basically killed off in a way that is almost sort of tongue-in-cheek in a way of the typical villains giving their big speech about why it is that they're doing what they're doing. Basically, Walter Simmons is around just to kind of kick the plot forward at the end of the day. And as far as his daughter, Maya Simmons, is concerned, she accompanies the expedition to the Hollow Earth and provides them with the heaves in order to get to there, while doing so with an ulterior motive in mind to retrieve a power source for her father's work to be completed. After that's done, she is then killed by Kong when she tries to escape. There's solid enough inference to make that she is second in command in terms of leadership at Apex due to her nepotism, but beyond that, there isn't much else to say about her, as she's basically a secondary human antagonist who is essential enough in the plot so that she isn't without purpose. Overall, Walter Simmons and his daughter aren't exactly deep in terms of characterization, but they're serviceable enough as far as villains go, in terms of being the characters to set certain things in the plot into motion. So now let's address Ren Sarazawa for a bit here. Supposedly, this character is the son of the late Dr. Ishiro Sarazawa, the character played by Ken Watanabe, who sacrificed his life back in the events of King of the Monsters. We first see Ren watching Godzilla attack the Apex facility in Pensacola, Florida for a little bit, before he is told by Walter Simmons to join up with him at the helicopter to evacuate. For the rest of the film, he's with Simmons, as well as operating Mechagodzilla, via a neurological link from the skull of the Ghidorah head that was retrieved in Isla de Mara. He is then killed once the consciousness of Ghidorah transfers itself into Mechagodzilla and takes control of the kaiju-sized war machine. Now, even when I saw Godzilla vs. Kong for the first time, and even as I was singing the film's praises into high heaven at the time, I did point out how odd it was that Ren Sarazawa, despite being the son of such a significant character in the MonsterVerse, wasn't featured all that much or given much to do. There are some moments, like when he was observing Godzilla as he attacks the Pensacola facility, and when he was visibly displaying a sort of satisfaction from killing a skullcrawler while piloting Mechagodzilla. We could interpret that he wishes to be either like Godzilla or to be something greater than Godzilla, but it's inference at best, and we don't quite get an insight in why he would be working with Walter Simmons in creating a weapon to kill the very creature whom his father died for. Is it just prejudice towards Titans in general, or is there a personal grudge against Godzilla? We're never spared a moment where we get some sort of insight into Ren Sarazawa and what his story is. And it's a shame too, because there are seeds of a good story about at least one of these human antagonists that could blossom if we had just a little more time in the film to devote to it. Or another solution could have been to just do a simple name change. like from Ren Sarazawa to, oh, let's say Ren Otakashi, then there wouldn't be as much stock being put in this character, like how there was leading up to this film's release as a result of his last name having some legacy behind it. There is also the question of how Walter Simmons retrieved the Ghidorah head, which the last time we saw of it was acquired by Alan Jonah, the character played by Charles Dance in the post-credits scene in King of the Monsters. Now, a fair assumption can be made that Simmons bought the head from Jonah, as Jonah does deal in the black market of Titan-related assets, and Simmons is a character who comes off as not exactly being above dealing in potentially illegal activity in order to get his weapon prepped and ready to put mankind back at the top of the food chain. Again, it's only an assumption that does have some logical basis, but even then, a more concrete detailing would have certainly helped. And I have to stress that if there is an explanation for this, but it's in something like the novelization for the film, then I'm sorry, but that doesn't count. The information should be in the film, and the novelization should be nothing more than a fun extra piece for fans to pick up if they enjoyed the film. Not something that one needs to buy and consume in order to properly consume the film itself. And this does bring up a point that I do want to elaborate on. For you see, I don't wish to disparage third-party material out there, because I've seen and read such material that's well done. But what I'm trying to get across is that I should be able to do something like watch a film and not have to worry about needing to do what is essentially research and consume something from a completely different medium in order to understand the film. Things like Batman Gotham Knights, the Star Wars Expanded Universe, as in the old canon, and heck, the MonsterVerse tie-in comics feature stories that you don't need to consume in order to properly consume and understand the films in their respective franchises, but can be consumed if you want to get a better look into things like the lore in those franchises. Even if some of these aren't technically canon, whether it's due to some contradictory canon or due to a statement made by a certain studio on what is or isn't canon. Or if you want to look into more stories set in your favorite franchise, just for fun. However, what I want to discourage, and what I hope others would want to discourage, is the notion that storytellers, such as filmmakers, can rely on third-party material in order for certain holes in their stories to be filled. For example, if anybody wondered about how Palpatine came back in Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker, and found the vagueness in how he came back, such as the line which calls back to Revenge of the Sith, to simply not suffice, there is a novelization for the film out there that has an excerpt that explains how he was able to use the Force to transfer his soul or consciousness or whatever all the way from the second Death Star to Exegol as he was falling down the shaft at the end of Return of the Jedi. Now, if we could all set aside just how terrible and stupid that all sounded, and let's be real, it is. My point is that the movie should have had a concrete explanation by all means, and no matter what that explanation is, about how the big bad of the first 6 films in the main Star Wars saga is all of a sudden back. Especially when there was no clear, solid, provable, or definitive setup for him to be back in The Force Awakens or The Last Jedi. And the fact that third-party content has to be consumed in order to get any sort of explanation for this big, out-of-nowhere reveal is just awful. It's a cheap attempt to milk more money off of fans who would be desperate for some kind of answer to the how and why of the once thought to be indisputably dead Emperor Palpatine being back, with such desperation being at least fairly understandable, because those would be the audience members who probably felt cheated while watching The Rise of Skywalker for the first time. While third-party material can be a neat thing to look into should audiences wish to seek it out in order to get a fix on a particular franchise. Seeking it out and consuming it should not, I repeat, should not be a requirement in order to get all the information and understanding one would need to consume something else. You should not need to consume Y in order to consume X. I should not need to subscribe to Disney Plus and watch the Hawkeye TV series on there in order to follow up on the post-credit scene in Black Widow regarding a certain character that was featured in that post-credit scene. Just to bring up another example on how an audience shouldn't have to be expected to go outside of the primary medium, like film, in a certain series and consume a piece of content set in that same series that's been released in a totally different medium such as television in order to properly understand and follow the story that's in the primary medium. Okay, that was a point of discussion that kinda turned into a bit of a rant by the end, so let's dial things back a bit, shall we? So, hopefully I've made it as crystal clear as possible that I am a fan of storytelling and of certain franchises, but I'm also a fan of giving audiences who are just getting introduced to such franchise to get the best first impressions possible. And let's just say that one way to achieve that is by having that audience watch a film or a string of films without needing to get a tie-in book from Barnes & Nobles in order to fully understand the films, their stories, their world building and lore, the characters, and their motivations that are featured in those films, and so on. Basically, it all boils down to a big difference between stories that put in the legwork to get audiences invested in them, with such stories being ones that should be celebrated for doing so, and stories that take the easy way out and expect people to have done some homework in order to consume such stories, which should not be the case. So now, even though we have spent quite a lot of time on the human characters in Godzilla vs. Kong, there is still the matter of the Titans which are present in the film. They're worth noting because they also count as characters themselves. Contrary to popular belief, Godzilla, Kong, and Mechagodzilla are all characters who have significant roles in the story, and take part in events of such, and in Godzilla and Kong's cases, undergo a certain level of development during the film. First, let's talk about Kong, who is the primary character in the Titans side of things. Kong goes through an arc of rediscovering his purpose and place in the world. He starts out as not much more than an animal in a cage, though understandably so, when he is held in an containment dome intended to shelter him from the perpetual storm that has overwhelmed Skull Island, as well as potentially protect him from rival Alpha Titans like Godzilla. Once he finally arrives in the Hollow Earth, Kong discovers his heritage, and despite still being very much alone, embraces that heritage in triumph, where he has found a new home and a new purpose. However, when his new home is attacked by Godzilla during the big lizard boy's atomic drilling, Kong goes off carrying his newfound weapon, a battle axe forged by his ancestors out of the remains of old members of Godzilla's species, to challenge his rival. An epic battle ensues between the two Alpha Titans in Hong Kong. Despite winning a round thanks to his axe, Kong is overwhelmed by Godzilla, to where he is left in a state where he goes into a form of unconsciousness where he is near death. Yet he still defies Godzilla when put in a position to submit or die. Then, when he is resuscitated by Nathan Lin, Kong is convinced by Gia to help Godzilla and defeat Mechagodzilla. Through the efforts of other human characters and even Godzilla himself, Kong is able to finally overcome Mechagodzilla and win the day. In the aftermath, Kong lays down his weapon and forms a truce with Godzilla, and both leave to continue existing in the natural order without conflict from one another, where Kong is last seen to live a happier life in the Hollow Earth, having found a new place to call home. Now, before we bring this discussion on Kong full circle, while people have considered Kong fixing his dislocated shoulder to be somewhat out there is a better point to be made that is admittedly worth addressing, where a question is begged for on how electrical defibrillation would be enough to heal a caved-in chest, especially one such as Kong's, where his chest got stomped in by Godzilla, and that resulted in his unable to continue fighting the latter. At least a dislocated shoulder can feasibly be fixed right on the spot, and easily so, especially considering the state of urgency at that time. But a stomped-in chest might need a lot more work down the line, and something like that typically wouldn't get fixed that easily through electrical defibrillation. There is also the question of where and when Kong learned how to swim, such as when he was trying to escape Godzilla underwater during the Tasman Sea sequence. Sure, he wasn't swimming like he was Michael Phelps or anything, but if we had some sort of detailing or explanation about Kong having learned how to swim up to that point, that would have helped, especially considering that Kong needing to know how to swim was key to him coming out of Godzilla's attack alive. Perhaps the film could have established it the same way as how he learned sign language, in that there could be mention through dialogue about how primates are capable of intuitive learning due to having larger brains than most mammals. Ergo, Kong, being a former primate himself, would be capable of learning such things as swimming, on his own or otherwise. Just a little something to consider, you know? Despite those things, however, Kong in his arc is done very well, where he is portrayed in a sympathetic light as he was in past iterations, and undergoes an arc that adds further into that sympathy and pays off in a satisfying and powerful way once he finds himself in the hollow earth and rediscovers his purpose to be a king in his new home, ending the film with a sense that both Kong and Godzilla can coexist in peace, where the former would live and prosper in the hollow earth, while Godzilla would be king in the world above. As previously mentioned, Kong also displays the capability of communicating through sign language, making things very apparent in how strong of a bond he has with Gia, adding a sense of humanization in him as well as a parallel between him and mankind. When it comes to Kong, the film gives us an endearing underdog story about said Titan discovering a new sense of purpose in the world, thus making him a strong main character in the film. Now onto the other side of the coin, that is the title conflict, where we have Godzilla. He starts out as seemingly against humanity, as shown when he was destroying the Apex facility in Pensacola, and when he's going after Kong in the Tasman Sea when the human fleet was escorting the latter. These attacks, particularly the Pensacola one, are interpreted by the public as the end of an alliance, and by Monarch as a sudden change of behavior, while Madison recognizes it as not as simple as such. Eventually, with the reveal of Mechagodzilla and the involvement of the Ghidorah brain and skull, it's all confirmed that Godzilla didn't suddenly sour on humanity, but rather sensed the presence of his old nemesis and its potential return. Godzilla's instinctual rivalry with Kong, who was also an alpha that could challenge him based on their species' past, as well as the battle at the Tasman Sea where the former attacks the fleet that is escorting the latter to Antarctica, also stoked the flames of him seeming to have become a villain for mankind. While Godzilla's hostility towards Kong certainly stems from the ancient rivalry, it's mainly from the former trying to quell any potential threat to his real mission on top of the goal to force the latter to submit to his rule. When Kong refuses to submit, Godzilla recognizes the defiance and leaves him to die with whatever pride remains. After Kong is dealt with, Godzilla finally encounters Mechagodzilla, only to be overwhelmed by the mech that is under the control of the Ghidorah head by that point. When Kong intervenes right before Godzilla is killed and destroys the mech, the king recognizes his former challenger with respect and leaves him be once the latter accepts a truce. Godzilla's characterization in GVK maintains how the Titan acts out of seeking to preserve balance in a natural order no matter what, as we were shown in Godzilla 2014 and King of the Monsters. Only this time it's shown as being more gray due to Godzilla attacking a human facility, seemingly out of nowhere on the surface, but in actuality out of a sense of duty to try to find what remains of Ghidorah and destroy it, as well as due to him pursuing Kong, who could potentially thwart his mission. The context presented in this film allows for Godzilla to be portrayed in a more ominous light, while still maintaining what he's really all about. Now, even though we have gone over quite extensively on Godzilla and Kong, we still have one more Titan to consider, and that Titan is none other than the main villain of the film, as well as the thing that drives the plot, Mechagodzilla. Mechagodzilla is a Titan-sized machine built by Apex Cybernetics, with the project being spearheaded by Walter Simmons to quell and destroy any and all Titans as a means to put mankind back on top of the global food chain as the Apex species. In order to efficiently pilot the mech, Apex acquired a skull of Kevin, the left head of King Ghidorah that was decapitated by Godzilla during the events of King of the Monsters, so that Ren Serizawa would go on to serve as a pilot for Mechagodzilla via a neural uplink. However, unbeknownst to them, the skull of Kevin still retained some life signs which remained dormant and waiting until Apex was able to acquire a sufficient energy source from the hollow Earth in order for Mechagodzilla to run at maximum efficiency. Once Apex was able to synthesize that energy, Kevin's consciousness, through the neural uplink, would go on to hijack Mechagodzilla and begin his rampage in Hong Kong, killing Walter Simmons and Ren Serizawa in the process. Mechagodzilla, now under control of a vengeful Kevin, then battles and outmatches Godzilla, only to eventually be destroyed by Kong. Mechagodzilla displays a strong desire to destroy, just as Ghidorah once did when he attacks Hong Kong, and shows a relentlessly vengeful side when he battles Godzilla and literally throws him around. So there are some people out there, even other YouTubers like Filmento, who have compared Mechagodzilla in GVK to Doomsday in Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, and seem to address it in a negative light, and I am left perplexed as to why. I would consider Mechagodzilla's presence to be far less problematic in GVK than what was done with Doomsday in BVS, and I can explain why. While it's safe to say that there is a decent amount of people out there who would agree with my statement here, let's get right into it anyways for those who might be on the fence, shall we? Now, as a side note, I actually do like Batman v Superman, but that movie is an objectively flawed film in quite a few areas, and I'll go as far as to say that it's more objectively flawed than Godzilla vs. Kong. Regarding why that's the case, Doomsday's implementation into the story in BVS was based on flawed logic, in that Lex Luthor created him as a part of a Plan B to send after Superman just in case Batman failed to kill the Man of Steel for whatever reason, without, at least as it seems, having any sort of apparent means to contain Doomsday in case Batman actually succeeded. Not to mention, Doomsday was brought in as a secondary element in BVS, completely separate from the title conflict, as well as a means, even in such a contrived manner, to have what is only the second film in the DCEU end with the death of Superman, thus wasting the potential of that major event to be used in a later film where it could have had more impact. Meanwhile, we have Mechagodzilla, who isn't just a secondary element to be wasted in a film, but rather he is the driving force in the story. Without Mechagodzilla, there wouldn't be a reason for Godzilla to attack Apex, or strong enough reason for Monarch to agree to a risky venture to get Kong to the Hollow Earth, or enough of a reason for Bernie to infiltrate and try to expose Apex, which all leads to him uncovering their secret plan. Suffice it to say, I was not a fan of Filmento's video on Godzilla vs. Kong, where he considers it to be how to succeed at Batman v Superman, just because it has a semi-similar concept and structure. I could honestly pick that video apart and point out just how much of a flawed overgeneralization of the film it was, with a very apparent intention to get a very specific narrative or thesis across. But for the sake of moving right along with the rest of this video, considering how long this part has already been as it is, like, good lord, this thing is pretty much just about eclipsed my essay video series on King of the Monsters, or at least get there. And we haven't even gotten to the world building of this film yet. Basically, it goes to show that it's not so much the idea of two heroes in conflict with each other, only to eventually team up, is inherently a bad idea, but rather it's the execution of that idea and the mechanics that are in place that are the reason why one story falters and why another with that same idea works. Anyway, let's move right on to another topic regarding the story and character work in Godzilla vs. Kong. The film, despite many considering it to be mere escapism, does have a thematic core worth discussing, which carries over from the past 3 films in the MonsterVerse, about the balance between mankind and nature and how symbiosis between the two is essential, as well as how, to paraphrase Godzilla 2014, the arrogance of man can potentially lead to their downfall. While Godzilla vs. Kong doesn't expand on the overarching themes of the MonsterVerse in the same extent that King of the Monsters did, such themes still persist. The theme of symbiosis is represented by how Nathan Lind, Eileen Andrews, Gia, and company seek to move Kong from Skull Island, which had been swept up by a perpetual storm, to a potential new home in the Hollow Earth. There is also Madison, Josh, and Bernie and their quest to expose Apex and potentially thwart their plan, which all culminates to them sabotaging Mechagodzilla remotely in order to buy Kong and Godzilla enough time to defeat the mech gone rogue. By keeping certain natural forces such as Kong alive, as well as by seeking to correct certain mistakes made by its fellow members, mankind is able to help in maintaining balance in the natural order, as it is shown when Kong and Godzilla are able to stop Mechagodzilla and win the day. The character of Gia, considering her Iwi background and her connection with Kong, alone serves as an example of the bridging relationship between mankind and Titan, and the symbiosis where both groups depend on each other in order to prosper. Kong protected Gia when she was left an orphan, as well as goes on to protect her and others throughout the film, while Gia has interactions with Kong, from soothing him when he is upset by a situation on the boat, to convincing him to take certain actions, such as to go through the tunnel to the Hollow Earth in Antarctica, and helping Godzilla in fighting Mechagodzilla. Another theme that is featured in GVK, as I previously mentioned, is one of caution regarding the arrogance of man, and it is represented by how Walter Simmons seeks to take down Godzilla and all Titans by building Mechagodzilla as a way to control nature, only for his plan to not come to fruition as a result of the consciousness in a Ghidorah head taking control of the mech and threatening to destroy everything, which showcases just how misguided Simmons was in his venture. When it's all said and done, even though Godzilla vs. Kong may not be as substantive in the thematic side of things as other entries in the MonsterVerse, it still manages to maintain a consistent through line in what the series is all about. So, I think that just about does it in terms of discussing the story and characters in Godzilla vs. Kong. Coming up next in this essay video series, I will be going into quite a bit of detail into the world building that the film introduces and or expands on in the greater MonsterVerse. So stay tuned for that in part 2. But until then, thank you all for watching, and again, thanks for sticking through this one. This has definitely been quite a bit of a long part. But surprisingly, I had a lot more to say about this film regarding its story and characters and thematic core and so on than I had initially anticipated, so I wanted to get it all out there in one big bunch in this first part of the series. Once again, I thank you all for watching, and until part 2, I will see you all later.